Well, hey there, welcome back. So we're halfway through the letter. Now, that doesn't mean we're halfway through the series. We'll probably finish it up in at least a couple more episodes, but we're certainly at the halfway point of the letter. And at this point, Paul completely shifts his focus. For the first two chapters, what he's been focused on is what is typical of a letter of friendship, which is what we talked about this letter being way back at the start, which is basically just to catch up on how life is going, what he's up to, and particularly to assure them that his circumstances are better than expected, that he's in prison, but it's actually working out really well for him, that it's opening up opportunities that he wouldn't have otherwise had, and especially to encourage them that Epaphroditus, who they had originally sent with the support, he's doing fine as well. So things are going pretty good as far as they can possibly be going well, given the actual circumstances. They're actually pretty good for why Paul finds himself. So the first two chapters have really been about that, really just to touch base and also to encourage them. It's almost okay, look, I'm doing okay, but I may never get to see you again. And so what I need to do is to at least encourage you to continue doing what you're doing. You've been doing really well. You're a great church. We've got a great relationship. Keep it up. So the things that you've been doing, keep doing them. Be humble the same way Christ is in your relationships with one another and all of that. So carry on as you are. All of that is fantastic. Well done. But there's another thing that he has to sort of focus on now, which is, again, it's in light of if I don't get to see you again. If it comes to be that this is the last communication I ever have with you, I still need to give you some warning or some encouragement, some instruction on just what to be aware of. So, there's encouragement to what you're doing well, but also be aware of the things that can bring you undone. And so what he turns to now is that, and specifically what he wants to focus on now are the potential risk of false teachers. Now, whether or not these teachers are actually in Philippi or actually at work yet, the way that he talks about it is more in the sense of just in case they turn up. They may not necessarily be there yet, but there's every chance that they will be. So just be aware of that and understand who these people are. Understand what is wrong with their message and why it is in complete contradiction to who I am and what I've been teaching you all this time. So what we're going to look at today are these false teachers and what Paul has to say about them in Philippians 3. Now, in order to get some context to who these teachers are, we need to go back a little bit into Jewish history to understand where the Jews have come to at this point and why these teachers are in existence, who they are, what they're about, and in particular why they're such a threat. Now, the name that we give these particular teachers are Judaizers. And basically what is at the core of their message is that they are Jewish Christians who are insisting that Gentile Christians need to be Jewish in order to be Christian. So you haven't quite become fully Christian until you've been circumcised, until you basically living like a Jewish person. Then you can be truly the people of God, and at that point you can become Christian. So they are traditional Jewish Christians traditional Jews who've become Christian, who are now of the understanding or of the belief that to be fully Christian, you have to be fully Jewish at the same time. So that's what their basic message is. But again, in order to understand where that comes from and what is at the core of their message, we need to get a better sense then of where the Jewish people have come to at that point and why this stuff is so important. All right, so the story actually goes back to the exile. So if you remember in Jewish history, the chief event, one of the probably the most cataclysmic event that took place for the Jewish people was their exile into Babylon. Not the exodus out of Egypt. That was a great moment. That was the Passover, and that was the great the birthing of the people of God. What was their great calamity was their exile. And so they've come out of Egypt, they've become the people of God. And what God has effectively said to them are a couple of core things. You are to worship me and me alone. That's rule number one. You will have no gods before me. So you will be a monotheistic culture. You will only worship me. And that's the top of the list. Along with that, there are certain things you're going to do. You're going to circumcise all of your children, obviously all of your boys, and that's going to be a mark that you are the people of God. Now, what it means to be the people of God is to be the children of Abraham, so to actually be direct descendants ethnically from Abraham. So that's what makes you, as the Jewish people, therefore the people of God. And what is going to mark you out physically is circumcision. So that's a core principle, it's a core practice of the Jewish people, and that's what sets them apart from all of the other people who were really quite disgusted at the idea of circumcision. That was always historically something that all of the other cultures really just reviled. And so in order to do for the Jewish people to do that really does set them apart, because nobody else would do that. So circumcision is essential. Along with that is Sabbath. Observing Sabbath every Saturday. You take a day off. It's not just a nice idea, have a day off, but it's actually part of our culture. It's part of our rules. And so to violate Sabbath actually is something that is punishable. So Sabbath is absolutely essential. Kosher as well. There are only certain foods that you can and should eat, and the rest of it is forbidden. You can't eat that stuff. Everybody else will, but this stuff is absolutely off limits for you. And so most notably amongst those are things like pigs, for example. So you can't eat any of that food. You need to eat kosher. That is another marker of what sets you apart as being the people of God. And then, of course, it's just being obedient to my commandments. I've made it very clear to you what I expect from you. These are the things you need to do. And when you violate those, you'll be under a curse. And so it's really quite simple. When God establishes a nation, he says to them, these are the rules. These are literally the laws of the land. Do these things and you'll be blessed. Don't do them, you'll be cursed. You'll go into exile. And so it's a very, very black and white situation that God had set up for his people. And that's all fine, pretty clear. And God says, I'm not going to change my mind. These rules are fixed. I will never change my mind. If I do, I'll let you know. But in the meantime, do this from now going forward, and you'll do really well. You'll be blessed in the land. It's going to be great for you. You and your children and their children, everyone's going to do really well. It's going to be great. Unfortunately, the Jewish people broke those laws. They didn't do what was asked of them, primary amongst those things being idolatry. As far as the Jewish worldview is concerned, the problem with humanity is idolatry. You've worshipped all of these other gods, and really that was the problem that goes all the way back to the garden. Back in the garden, we were created for relationship, and we said, "Nah, we're okay, God. We can do it ourselves. We can do our own thing. We can figure it out for ourselves. We don't need you anymore." So basically, what you've done is you've set yourself up as your own God. That was the core problem. And from that moment forward, humanity just went into a spiral. Everything just went downhill from there. So idolatry in the Jewish mind leads immediately to particularly sexual immorality, but all forms of immorality, impurity, and all of these things. So it's sort of a descending spiral of decay that the human race has descended into. And so what happened for the Jewish people was that they went into idolatry. They worshipped the gods of the nations around them, and as a result, they came unstuck. Everything went into a downward spiral, and the punishment for that was what God had said all along. If you do these things, you'll be cursed. You'll go into exile. I will disband you. I'll take you out of the land. I'll spread you out amongst foreign people. Everything that God had said he was going to do is exactly what happened when the Jewish people went into exile. And so the sort of climactic event took place in 586 BC, which is when the Jewish people were literally just picked up en masse, taken out of their land and brought over into Babylon. So this is the great exile that took place. So one way we can sort of look at the exile was something kind of like, sending your kids to their room to think about what they've done, right? Having a time out. Go away, think about what you've done, reflect, and when you come out, hopefully you've learned your lesson. The lesson being, don't do this again, because if you do it again, you're going to go into exile. You're going to go back into another timeout. That's kind of what sort of took place over the next 70 years for the Jewish people. They went into exile, and we read their stories, particularly in the book of Daniel, in Esther, sort of Ruth, these sort of books where you see what was actually occurring during this exile. But basically at the core of what was happening during this time was that it was a time of reflection. It was a recognition that God did what he said he was going to do. He sent us into exile because we went into idolatry. We did the very thing you told us not to do. This is our due punishment. And so there was a reflective moment. There was they did realize what had gone wrong, and they wanted to learn from that. They realized the error of their ways. They didn't become arrogant about it. They didn't sort of go, oh, we're going to go do our own thing now. No, they recognized the sin that they had committed and really tried to work out, all right, how do we resolve this? How do we reverse what it is that we've done? Now, what that situation creates is a real challenge for the Jewish people. The thing about being the people of God is that you need to have a land. That was what God had given them, that land. That's what made them a nation. So as a people, as a nation, they had land. They actually had a geographical location that they could call home. It had its own boundaries and borders and all of this. And importantly, they had a temple as well. They had a place where they could go and encounter their God. And so they had everything that was required to be a people, and to be a people dedicated to Yahweh. They had his temple in their land that he had given to them. That's what made them the people of God. That was what created them as unique people. But now they don't have that. Now they're in Babylon. Now you don't have that same access. You don't have that same situation where you can freely worship that God. The thing about being a nation of your own people within a safe, secure area with your own temple is that it's much easier to be the people of God because you don't have cultural challenges. The culture is the people of God. The attitudes and the beliefs amongst all of the citizens is Yahweh. So it's very easy in that circumstance. It's kind of, it's like, being a Christian in a community that is full of Christians and the only people you know are Christians, and you go to church with all the same people and your kids go to school with Christians, and everything about your life, all your friends, all your social networks, even where you work, if everything is Christian, it's very easy to be Christian. In fact, it's harder not to be Christian because to not be Christian kind of puts you on the outer. You kind of become kind of an out group at that point. So when you're surrounded by your worldview, it's much easier to embody it, to embrace it. So in a land where you've got a temple, you can do that. That's a much easier thing for the people. Now you're in Babylon. Now you're not just in a city with native Babylonians, but Babylon was an absolute metropolis. It was people from all over the world, every culture, every race, every tongue was all represented in Babylon. It's like a modern Western major city where you've got people from all ethnicities, people from every diverse background, all living and coexisting together, and every language being spoken all at the same time. That's kind of like what Babylon was. And so it's much, much harder in that context to keep together, to keep your own identity, especially when you don't have the temple anymore. You don't have the temple of Yahweh because that's back in Jerusalem and it's been destroyed. You're surrounded by temples of all of these other gods. It's much, much harder to maintain that unique identity when you don't have the cultural protections around you that really sort of shelter you into that particular situation. So then for the Jewish people, and particularly for their children, they were there for a long time. 70 years is a long time. In any generation, that's a long time. And in 70 years, a lot of generations can be born. I think if we go back to 1955, my dad was only 5 years old at that point, but his parents were alive, his grandparents were alive, and maybe even some great-grandparents. I don't quite know how far back the generations were still alive. But then since then, he's had my generation, and now there's been my children, and then there's still the generations sort of going before that. There's been a lot of generations in only a matter of 70 years, and my children are so remote from his grandparents 6 generations ago, even though it's all within that 70-year time span. So all to say, that's a long separate. That's a lot of generations that can emerge within that period of time. So for those people, the ones that have been born in Babylon, they're getting further and further separated from the land. I mean, they've never been to the land. It's not even a memory for them. It's just a story that their parents or their grandparents have told them. So they have no connection back to that. They know that they're the people of God, but they don't have any sort of memories or reflections of the temple or of the land. And so for those people, and particularly just for all of those generations who are living in Babylon, how do you keep a sense of your identity? How do you remain the people of God when, again, you don't have the sort of the geographical protections that the land had provided? Well, what you need to do now is focus in on the things that you can do. God had given them the land, he'd given them the temple, all of that was fine, but we don't have that anymore. So what are the other things that we have that make us the unique people of God that we can do in this place of exile? Well, circumcision is an obvious one. We can still circumcise our children, and that is what's going to set us apart, especially now when we're actually outnumbered. We're the minority now amongst all of these foreign nations who don't circumcise their kids. We have that as a unique marker. So we always know that we're the people of God because we're the one small group that does that. Whereas, again, back in the land, everybody did it. It's like, well, we're all the people of God. We all circumcise. There's nothing to compare that with. Now it's a different story. So circumcision becomes a very unique identifying marker, and it becomes more widely known, more prominently known. And it carries through, really, till today, but certainly through into the time of the New Testament, where, one of the things that the Jews were characterized for is circumcision. In fact, so much so that there was in some cases, some of the Jewish men would have their circumcisions reversed. Now, they did have a procedure for that, and what that would have been like without anesthetic, I don't even want to think about. But they had a procedure for that because they didn't want to be necessarily recognized as being Jewish people. They wanted to be able to engage with the culture around them. And if people knew that they were circumcised, then they knew they were Jewish, maybe less inclined to want to deal with them. So it was something very characteristic of being Jewish, the Jewish people. So circumcision was a key. That was absolutely essential. But a second thing that they can really double down on is law keeping. So what got us in trouble in the first place is that we had God's laws and we broke them. Simple. We just violated those laws as clear black and white laws, 10 simple commandments. We broke them. That's why we got to be where we are today. And so what we need to do now is to figure out or to make sure that that never happens again. In fact, what we really need to do is to make sure that we really canonize what these laws are. The ancient world is an oral culture. It's one where you transmit knowledge and information to memory. You commit it to memory. And particularly when it comes to important religious information, that's something you commit to memory. And for the fact that most people can't read, orality is absolutely essential. But we've got scrolls and we've got writings and we've got different pieces of information that are our sacred texts and there are sacred writings and all of this. But maybe there's not necessarily agreement on what all of that is, or maybe it's just sort of a bit scattered, it's a bit disparate. So what we need to do now that we're here, now that this is all that we have, we broke these laws in the first place, so now we need to make sure that we're really clear on what they are. What we need to do is we need to agree and canonize what these scriptures are. So it's during this time in Babylon where you start to see the canonization of the Old Testament. You start to see the formation of the Old Testament where they're coming to an agreement as to what these scriptures are and actually starting to even write down what some of these oral traditions are, some of these ideas that have been passed on, just literally by word of mouth. Now we're going to start to write some of these down so that we are really clear on what they are and that we can pass them on to our children. So we have a written record of what God expects from us because, again, we don't want to break these rules again. So we need to be really, really clear on what these rules are. So we have the creation, the construction of Torah during this time, and then the requirements to live according to that. So obedience to the law is absolutely paramount for the Jewish people. Above all else, it's absolutely, and again, particularly because we don't have the ability to worship in the temple. We can't go and experience Yahweh during worship in the temple. Now we have to do it in a different form. And the way that we're going to do that is through study. We're going to do it through Torah. Now, along with that, what we need are teachers. We need people who are experts in this law, people who have studied it and come to understand it, and particularly interpreters of the law, people who can read this law, but laws that were written for people who were living in the desert or people who were living in their own land where they could make their own legal laws and rules and this sort of thing. We don't have that circumstance or that context anymore. So now we need to figure out, how do we live according to God's requirements in a place like Babylon? Or as we're scattered through the diaspora, how do we live according to according to the law, in a context where we don't have the freedom necessarily to do that. And even when we get back to the land, it's not going to be our land. It wasn't the land when they got back. They were still, it belonged to the Persians. So how do we live in this land even when it's not our land? So you need people who are not just familiar with the law, but who are trained in the law so that they can bring interpretation of what does the Sabbath look like in a place like Babylon, or what does kosher look like in a place like Babylon? How do we do that? What are the foods that we can and can't eat now? So all of those sort of things have to be figured out and continually figured out in the evolving contexts that the Jewish people find themselves in. So what we need in that circumstance are not priests, because priests function in a temple. We don't have a temple, right? That's done away with. And if and when we get back to Jerusalem, we'll reestablish a priesthood. But there's no need for a priesthood when there's no temple. What we need are the people who can show us how to live according to the law. What we need are teachers. We need rabbis in order to do that. But the other thing we need to prioritize along with that is purity. Now, this is a really important term for people living in the ancient world. Maybe not necessarily so much for us today, this idea of purity, like what do we even mean by that? What it means for the ancient person is something very specific related to religious practices. So we think about purity, and if we have any sort of biblical context for it or understanding of that, we will typically think about the Jewish people. But actually, the idea of being ritually or spiritual or ritually pure is something that was important for everybody, Greeks, Romans, everybody in the ancient world. Now, what it basically means is that when you approach the gods, you need to be pure. You need to be clean, right? You don't want to come defiled, dirty, whatever. You don't want to. You want to be dressed to your best standard. It's like turning up to a wedding, having just been out doing the garden or something, covered in dirt. Like it's not good. Like it's not something you would ever consider doing. So when you're approaching the gods, you need to be ritually pure. You need to be of a state that is appropriate for being in the presence of that particular God. Now, what that means for a typical Gentile, for Romans, for the Greeks, for these sort of guys, what that looks like is physical purity. So you need to be washed, right? You need to have been bathed, and that could just simply be a ritual bathing or just sort of a token bathing of sort of washing your hands, washing your face, just in order to at least give a sense of being clean, of being pure. It may not be that it's not like everyone's houses have baths. No one even generally has baths at all. They don't exist. It's not like you need to be, you've just had a shower, but you've at least given a token gesture of basic purity. But more than that, what it looks like is that you are you're clean in the sense, as an example, if somebody has just had sex, as an example of this, that is going to make you impure. Right? Just the whole process of it and all of that, it's going to leave you unclean. And so you need to be bathed from that. At the very least, you need to be bathed from that. You can't, anything sort of that might defile you in some way, you need to be cleaned of that. For a woman particularly who is menstruating, is another form of impurity. She's defiled during that process, and so can't approach the gods during that. So it's those sorts of things. It's being bathed in that sort of sense, but it's being putting on your best appearance as much as possible and being as clean as possible so that you can be in an appropriate state to stand before the God. Hopefully that explanation has made sense. Anyway, for the Jewish people, they have the same idea of purity. You don't approach God in an impure state. But for the Jewish people, purity ran much deeper than just the exterior. For the Greeks and for the Romans, it was external purity. It was basically like having a shower. It was that sort of understanding of what purity is. But it wasn't as concerned with the internal state of the person because they didn't really have the same understanding of sin that the Jewish people do. And so it doesn't really matter the quality of person you are. It's only just a matter of, are you dressed well? Are you clean in the physical way to approach the God? Whereas again, for the Jewish people, it was the physical, but it was also the internal as well. It was also the spiritual. And so purity ran much, much deeper. And so what purity looked like was, well, are you in obedience to the laws? Are you living in accordance with Scripture? Because if you're not, that is what is defiling you. Actually, that's the worst form of defilement. I mean, you can shower and bathe and smell like roses, but you could still be an absolutely terrible person. And so if you're going to approach a holy God, then you need to make sure that you are in a holy state. Think about the Greek and Roman gods. The last last characteristic you would attribute to a Greek or Roman god is holiness. They were the most disgusting creatures you've ever come across. They were horrific, horrific creatures. And so for them to demand spiritual or emotional purity from their from their worshippers is just the height of hypocrisy. So they weren't concerned about that in their own people. All they were concerned about is your physical purity. But when you're talking about a holy God who is holy internally, you need to be reflective of that state as well. You can't just shower off your internal state. You actually need to be a person who is internally pure. Now, of course, you can't be perfect, and that in fact is the reason why you come to God in the first place, to be purified of your sin, to be purified of your transgression. The point of the sacrifice in a Greek and Roman religion was to keep the God happy, basically to buy an insurance policy for the next year to make sure that the gods don't kill you in some form or another. Whereas the Jewish people, you come and you offer a sacrifice for your sin, for your internal impurities that have been defiling you. It's not just about turning away the God's anger or to make God happy. It's really less to do with that as much as it is about being purified in yourself so that you can stand in his presence. So that's what the sacrifices were about. And again, in order to do that, you at least need to be ostensibly purified as a part of that process. So what that means then primarily is that you are not committing idolatry. You're not worshiping other gods. You will have no gods before me. And the whole perception that Jews have of a Gentile is that they are impure, not because they don't bath. They in fact do bath, but it's because of idolatry. It's because they worship all of these other gods. That's the thing that's actually caused them to be impure. That's the thing that actually has just filthied them. So idolatry is at the core of this. Any sort of worshipping of all of these false gods is the thing that actually defiles a person. And then as an extension of that is all of the sexual immorality and all of the things that go along with or are an extension of that initial idolatry. Those are the things that make a person impure. Whereas for a Greek or a Roman person, worshipping lots of gods and sexual immorality and all forms of immorality are of no consequence. They're not even something to raise an eyebrow about because that's just what we do. It's for them that, again, the purity is just simply an external thing. Whereas for the Jewish people look at that and say, no, that's actually what makes you impure. You might smell like roses, but you are a disgusting person inside, and that's what's wrong with you. That's actually what makes you truly impure. So then for the Jewish people, purity is firstly, it's a spiritual purity in that they are monotheistic. They only worship the one true God. They're not defiling themselves with idolatry. But then it's also a legal purity, or it's a moral purity in that you are living according to God's holy requirements. You are holy as God is holy. And again, primary amongst those things like sexual immorality, but all the other forms of immorality that go along with being a pagan. So you are spiritually pure, you're morally pure, but then also in the sense of what you eat. So you are pure in the sense that you only eat kosher. You're not eating defiled food that is unclean. So to eat unclean food is to make yourself unclean. It's to eat bad food, so you've got a bad physical system. So you're clean in that sense, but also that you're not eating food that's been defiled to an idol. Pretty much all meat in the ancient world. If ever you come across meat that's available in the ancient world, it has been sacrificed to a god. That's just how it is. There is no such thing as meat that is not tainted in some way by some form of idolatry. So if ever you've eaten meat, and this is what the Jewish concern around kosher was, it's not just that, eating pigs is unhygienic, it's that any form of meat you're going to come across has been offered to an idol, and so therefore it has been defiled through that process. So you are actually eating the product of that idolatry. So that in and of itself is defiling you in the same way. So you're sort of physically, not in the sense of, you've got smelly armpits, but you're physically defiled in that of the what it is that you've been putting into your body. So purity is of absolutely paramount importance for the Jewish people, but it is for the Greeks and Romans, but in a completely different way for the Jewish people. It is both external, but it's also internally, spiritually, morally, and physically as well. So that's the key things that the Jewish people double down on. So they go into exile and they double down on these characteristics. It's monotheism, it's obedience to the law, it's circumcision. These are the things that we can do. And you get examples of this. Think about the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are, given this option to, or being compelled to eat food that is unclean. And what do? Well, they refuse to do it. They don't eat this food. They'll just eat vegetables instead. And so it's that sort of idea. This is how we can demonstrate our loyalty to God, by keeping ourselves pure, by not eating this food that's been defiled to these Babylonian gods. So all of that emerges in Babylon. This is a very, very long introduction to where we're actually going with this, but that all emerges in Babylon. And so when the Jewish people come back, this is the way that they live now, and particularly for the majority of Jewish people, especially the ones that are living out in the diaspora, people who are not living in the land, who are certainly not living near the temple, people that are living in cities like Corinth or, for example, in Philippi. For them, they don't have access to the temple, they're not part of the land, and they're a minority within those cities. So for those guys, it's absolutely essential that they mark out their uniqueness, they mark themselves out as the people of God through these other ways. And that's just what it means to be Jewish. That's how everybody understands the Jews to be. That's what characterizes them from everybody else. And that's how it's been for centuries. The Jewish people have been doing this and still do, but certainly up until Paul's time, that's just how they've always done it, because that's what it means to be the people of God, and which is exactly what we are. All right, so that brings us back to our situation that Paul is faced with, or what Paul is warning these Philippians about, which is the possibility of these false teachers. Now, whether or not these teachers are actually in Philippi at work, we don't know. It could just be that they're a potential threat, which they always were. The problem that Paul has been facing this whole time is that his steps have always been dogged by these particular group of false teachers. And this goes all the way back to Galatians. When Paul's first letter, this is specifically what he's dealing with. He's dealing with these false teachers who are insisting that these new Gentile converts, these Christian converts that are coming from the Gentile world, have done part of the process to becoming the people of God, but haven't gone all the way. What they need to do is to now become fully Jewish in order to become fully Christian, because that's just what we've always done. That's what it's always meant to be, the people of God. And so why does Jesus change anything? Yes, Jesus has come to fulfill the old covenant, but we still have to live according to that covenant. We still have to live according to the requirements, because that has how it's always been. And so there's no reason why that shouldn't continue. So therefore, great, congratulations, you're a Christian, but let's help you finish the job. And so Paul's greatest opposition as a teacher is against these, what we call Judaizers. Now, what a Judaizer is somebody who is insisting that to be Christian, you have to be Jewish. And so what that means is, particularly for the Gentiles, you Gentiles have become Christian, fantastic, you've accepted Christ, and so you've kind of become almost the people of God, but now we need to finish the job. And the way that we're going to finish that job is that, above all else, we need to circumcise you. We need to make sure that you are physically marked out as the people of God, because that's how we've always done it. We've always marked ourselves out through circumcision. And so that doesn't change now just because of Jesus has come along. You still need to be physically marked out as the people of God. But then beyond that, you also need to live like Jewish people. You need to observe kosher. You need to eat only clean food. So you can't eat all of this meat that has been defiled by being sacrificed to these other gods, and certainly not eating pig or any of those things, which pig being one of the most common meats that you could come by, and so one of the most common sacrifices, as well as being hygienically unclean. All of that meant that it was something that the Jewish people just would never touch. It was just something they would never go near. So you can't do any of that anymore. So you need to be pure in that sense, clean in that sense in the things that you eat. But then also overall, you need to be obedient to the law. You need to do the things that are required by the law, because again, that's how we've always done this. You need to observe Sabbath. You need to do all the things that we Jewish people have always done, that have marked us out as the people of God. That's what you also need to do as well. And so for Paul, this is what he's been railing against throughout his whole ministry, going all the way back to his letter to the Galatians. It was to say, no, you are a Christian because you've received the Spirit, full stop. That's it. There's nothing else that needs to be done. What that Spirit has done is all of the internal work that the law previously required from us. It's all been done now by that. There's nothing you can add to this. And in fact, as he says to the Galatians, if you're going to presume to somehow complete your salvation by trying to be circumcised and try to do it yourself, you've actually nullified your salvation. You cannot say that Jesus saved you, but he didn't finish the job. If Jesus can't finish the job, well, guess what? He's not God. It's as simple as that. He can't. He either does the whole job or he does none of it at all. He's either all powerful or he's not powerful at all. And so if you're really going to say that Jesus got you halfway there, but you've got to finish the rest, what you're actually saying is that Jesus can't save and therefore he's not God. And so therefore, what was the point in starting with him in the first place? Because he's not God. He can't save you. It's as simple as that. So this is the great challenge that Paul has to confront throughout the course of his ministry, and that's no different in Philippians. Whether or not these teachers are actually there, present in the city, we don't know, but certainly this is the great threat that his Philippian converts are going to come up against. So he picks it up, chapter 3, verse 1. He says, "Further, my brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. It is no trouble for me to write the same things to you again, and it is a safeguard for you." So Paul's really good in the sense that he's giving them a general antidote to the threat from any of these false teachers or anything that they might confront them, which is just to rejoice in the Lord. Find your joy in him. If you have joy in that relationship and realize that you have the fullness of his pleasure already, why will you need to seek anything else? If just in your relationship you can find his fullness, what else can you possibly gain through trying to do these other things? It becomes completely redundant at that stage. So start from that place of joy. Know your place in him. Experience that place in him. And if you have that, you'll realize there is nothing more you can add to it. So beginning with rejoice in the Lord, and that will ultimately be the antidote. However, there are going to be threats, and one of the primary threats, again, is from these Judaizers. And so he gives a really stark warning against who these people are. And now notice he doesn't use the term Judaizers. So this is more of a theological term anyway, but he doesn't actually refer to them in a very dignified way or in a very political or a very diplomatic way. He says in verse 2, "Watch out for the dogs. Watch out for the evildoers. Watch out for the mutilators of the flesh." Yeah, this isn't exactly how you make friends with Judaizers. Basically call them the very opposite of the things that they claim to be about themselves. And it's like saying, it'll be like calling Donald Trump poor. You know, you're impoverished. Like, what the? That's kind of the height of insults here. So what he says about these people is firstly that they are dogs. Now, of course, we know that this is what the Jewish people used to call the Gentiles. And we have the example of it with Jesus saying, it's not right to take the food that belongs to the children and give it to their little dogs. This epithet, this insult that the Jewish people leveled against the Gentiles, it reflects back to their perception of the Gentiles' impurity. What characterizes a dog? Certainly a wild dog that would be wandering through the cities of the ancient world, and it's still many cities in that part of the world today. You see a lot of these just dogs absolutely everywhere, just wandering around, and they look all friendly and pleasant, but you kind of you're hesitant to pat them because you know that they probably have never had a bath and they're probably quite dirty and covered in germs and disease and all the rest of it, and so you kind of want to keep a distance because you just don't know what you might catch from touching the thing, and so for the Jewish people, that was the easiest insult to level against a Gentile, which is to remind them that you are unclean, you are impure, you're like a dog. There's no other way to put it. So Paul turns that back on them and he says, actually, you guys are the dogs. You guys are the ones that are impure. Now, what he's basing this on, we're not 100% sure because technically they're very pure. They're doing everything right in that sense, but it's really just I guess the general point is to say that what you've actually done, the way that you're pursuing God, is actually making you impure because you're trying to do it the old way. You're not doing it the new way, the proper way. So in doing that in a sense, is what is actually making you impure. At the very least, it's just calling them the very thing that they pride themselves on not being. And so actually, no, you're an outsider now. Because you're an outsider to the true faith, that makes you the same dog that you consider the Gentiles to be. You're actually just like those people in that way. So it's a pretty hard insult. It's pretty cruel not cruel, but it's a pretty straightforward sort of thing that Paul's saying here. But he's not finished. He goes on and he says, watch out for the evildoers. That's the last thing you're going to call a Jewish person who is priding themselves on the fact that they keep the law to the nth degree. I mean, these are, these sort of teachers are the ones that, boast about the fact that they are morally perfect, that they never break the law. Well, actually, it's not just that you are occasional lawbreakers, you're evildoers. You are acting contrary to the law. Now, there's a grain of truth in this because if the law proves that Jesus is the Christ and that only through Christ we can be saved, if you are saying Jesus isn't enough, then actually you're contradicting the law, which is actually to make you an evildoer. You're actually working directly against the law. And so how are you any different from a Gentile? How are you any different from the evildoers that you condemn for not upholding the law? So in the sense, you're actually the opposite of what you claim to be. But here he gets really personal. Then he says, and these mutilators of the flesh. And this is really getting to the heart of the issue of what these guys are insisting on for the for these Gentile Christians, is that the insistence on being circumcised is actually now a mutilation of the flesh. Now, the word he uses here is really quite descriptive. The word for circumcision in the Greek is the word peritome. So the word tome means to cut. So we get our word atom from. Atom just means indivisible. It means something that can no longer be cut anymore. It's at its smallest possible piece. And so it's atome, it's uncuttable. So peritome means to cut, but the peri means around. So literally it means to cut around. Now, again, I'm sure you can figure out what the implications of that are. The word he uses, though, to describe these false teachers is the word kata tome. So the tome is still there, it's the cut, but kata is a different thing. Kata means through. So you've got to cut around or to cut through. You're literally a mutilator of the flesh. Now, again, I don't need to unpack what I'm meaning by this, but I think you can kind of make the connection here. They are the mutilators of the flesh. Now, what that actually designates them as, again, is outsiders. You are not of the people of God because, well, you are mutilators of the flesh. Now, according to Leviticus 19 and then 19:18, according to Leviticus 19:28 and then Leviticus 21-18, it talks about this cutting your flesh or defiling your flesh in a way that actually separates you from the people of God, and actually goes so far as to talk about men with crushed private parts, that deformity would actually exclude you from the people of God. And so what Paul is describing here is a process, this process they're insisting on for the Gentiles, far from bringing them into the people of God, would actually exclude them. And so their teaching on circumcision is actually an exclusionary process. It actually pushes you away from the people of God, it has the absolute opposite effect. And so in that way, what they're doing is not a holy process. Actually, it's the very opposite. It's a mutilation of the flesh. And the consequences of that would be to be separated from the people of God. In fact, he actually has something similar to say back in Galatians. So in Galatians 5:12, he's talking about these same teachers. And he's saying about these agitators, these troublemakers in Galatia, he's saying, I just wish they go all the way. Like, they're talking about circumcision. Like, why stop at the tiny little bit, that tiny little bit of skin? Just cut the whole thing off. And he says, I wish they just go all the way and emasculate themselves. Just go and finish the job properly. Don't just beat around the bush. Just literally just cut the thing off, because that's what the value of circumcision actually is. It's literally to be castrated. So he says to these Philippians, that's what these guys are offering. They're not actually offering you a way into the people of God. What they're actually offering you is to be completely separated from the people of God in the same way that they are. They are dogs, which is to be a Gentile. They are evildoers, violators of the law, which again is to separate them from the people of God. And finally, physically, they're separated from the people of God. And all that they are trying to offer you is exactly the same thing: mutilation, to be evildoers, and to be dogs. That's what they're offering. You have already in you salvation, but to go and to listen to these guys is to literally have the opposite effect. And so he sort of finishes it off in verse 3. He says, for it is we who are the circumcision, we who serve God by his Spirit, who boast in Christ Jesus, and who put no confidence in the flesh. So if you're looking to try to achieve salvation through circumcision, why? You've already got it. And if what marked the people of God was circumcision, then we are, in a sense, already circumcised, even if we're not, because we're already the people of God. So whatever circumcision achieved in the sense of bringing into the people of God, you have it already. You are the true circumcision. Now, he talks about this in 2 Corinthians as being a circumcision of the heart. It's not just about taking off a piece of physical flesh, but it's to take off all of the flesh, all of the old self, and to be made new in Christ. That's what has actually occurred. It's a total transformation. You've been through that process already. There is nothing you can do physically that's going to change any of that. In fact, all you can do is to have the opposite effect. So you've done it already. We are already truly whatever it is that these guys are trying to bring you to through this process. You've got it already. We're already this true circumcision. And we are that because we're the ones who serve God by his Spirit, not by the law. We're not serving God by being rigidly obedient to his sets of laws. We're doing it by the Spirit. We already have that obedience that these law-abiding Jewish teachers are trying to get you to abide by. No, you're already doing it. You don't have to go and be strict adherents in the same way that these guys are. You're already doing that by the Spirit. You're already faithful. You're already in obedience by that process. So you've got the circumcision, you've got the obedience, and rather than be boastful about, look at me and look at my great achievements, you're boasting in God. You're already boasting in Christ. Whatever you might try to achieve by your own efforts, all that's going to amount to is to say, look how great I am. Look at the great things that I've done. What a fantastic person I am. No, well, that's completely redundant. Your boasting is in Christ, in Christ alone, because of what he has done for you. Only he can do all of this work. And so he's the only one that you can rightly boast in. And you're already doing that. So what else could you possibly add to this? You're boasting in Christ. You're obedient to Christ. You're already circumcised fully in the sense that the old flesh has been taken off. Again, what else is there you can possibly do that would make you any more the people of God? You've already got all of those things. So if and when these teachers turn up and start to insist on all of these other things, understand where you are, who you are, what you are, that you already have all of those things already in Christ. There's nothing else you can do to add to that. So that's a pretty straightforward argument. That's a pretty, look, you can try to do all of these things, but what's the point? You've already got them. But Paul wants to unpack this just to really insist, because the other thing that these guys will try to do is to try to undermine Paul. So it's one thing for them to come in and say, all right, Philippians, let us finish off your salvation process. Let us teach you the full gospel and everything you need to know about circumcision, all of that. It's that's one of their approaches, to come in and to try to convince the Philippians that they aren't fully Christian. But the next thing that they're going to do along with that is to undermine Paul. It's one, if you're a false teacher, then you also need to, if you're any sort of teacher and you're claiming to hold the truth, possess the truth, you need to set yourself up against your opposition. And so if these guys are saying we are the true teachers of the faith, then what they're going to have to do is discredit any opposing teachers, in this case, Paul. Now, Paul is doing the very same thing. Paul is saying, I am the true teacher of the gospel. These guys are the false teachers. Let me explain to you what is false about them. But those guys are going to try to do the same thing, and they're going to try to discredit Paul and say all of this stuff about Paul. And so what Paul has to do is to point out, or to explain to them, this is why you can trust me. So I'm telling you what salvation is, and I'm telling you you're already saved. And the Philippians might say, well, how do we know, Paul? Like, how do we know we can trust you when these other guys sound pretty convincing? So Paul has to sort of reaffirm his own status as a teacher of the gospel in order for the Philippians to be fully convinced, again, that they actually have the full truth and are actually living in that truth. So what we're going to do when we come back next week is we'll look at how Paul continues this on, but especially how he sort of reestablishes his own authority as a teacher. Again, you guys trust me, you are where you need to be, but here's why you can trust me. That's what he needs to move on to next. So that's what we'll come to. Again, we'll look at that next week. Otherwise, have a really, really great week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.